Part 3. The explosion shattered the silence. Light erupted from the core in a blinding burst, a force so powerful it sent shockwaves through the room. Jack, still standing at the heart of it, shielded his eyes as the world seemed to explode in a kaleidoscope of light and sound. The walls cracked, the floor buckled beneath him, and the very air itself felt like it was being torn apart. For a split second, everything went completely still. Then came the scream. It wasn't a human scream. It wasn't even a creature's. It was something raw and primal, a sound that echoed through the very bones of the train. The walls trembled, and the train groaned as though it were alive, struggling to breathe. "We have to move," Jack shouted, his voice barely audible over the deafening roar. Max and Sarah were already scrambling toward him, their faces etched with panic, eyes wide as the walls cracked and splintered around them. "Jack, we can't stay here," Sarah cried, her voice shaking. "I know," he shouted back, grabbing her arm. "We have to get out now." The room was coming apart. The core had released something that had been bound within the train for far too long, and now it was furious. The whole structure groaned under the weight of the entity's power, as if it were fighting back against its awakening. The figure, its form flickering violently in the chaos, let out a low growl. "You cannot escape." But Jack wasn't listening anymore. The walls around them were starting to buckle, the very ground beneath their feet shuddering with every passing second. It was clear now. The train was collapsing, unraveling in real time, and they had to get out before it consumed them all. "You've released me," the figure hissed, its voice growing more distorted. "Now you will pay the price." The air was thick with energy, crackling with the raw power of whatever had been trapped inside the core for so long. The floor beneath them splintered, and Jack barely managed to stay on his feet as the entire room seemed to tilt, the walls distorting into shapes that didn't make sense. "We need to find the exit." Max screamed, his eyes wild with panic. "Where is it?" Jack scanned the room quickly. The doorway they had entered was no longer visible. Everything was shifting, warping. The train's pulse was quickening, like the heartbeat of a beast on the verge of bursting free. "Through there!" Jack shouted, pointing to a darkened passageway that had opened up in the corner of the room. It wasn't much, but it was their only chance. They sprinted toward the opening, the air vibrating with the growl of the train and the voice of the entity that had been awakened. Behind them, the walls continued to collapse, sending chunks of debris crashing to the ground. Max and Sarah were right behind Jack, but the path was growing narrower. The very structure of the train seemed to be closing in on them, as if it were alive, suffocating them in its twisted, distorted embrace. As they reached the passageway, a loud crash erupted from behind them. Jack whipped around just in time to see a massive section of the ceiling give way, sending a shower of metal and debris crashing down toward them. "Run!" Jack shouted. They bolted into the passageway, the debris just missing them. Jack's heart raced in his chest as they pushed forward, the growl of the train's pulse still echoing behind them. The train was alive. Every creak, every groan was a manifestation of its fury, a warning that they weren't going to make it out easily. The passageway was narrow, its walls slick and cold, twisting and turning like a maze. Jack had no idea where it led, but they had no choice but to move forward. There was no turning back. "Is this the way out?" Sarah gasped, her breath coming in sharp, panicked bursts. "I don't know," Jack replied, his voice grim, "but it's the only way." Max stumbled slightly but caught himself, his eyes darting around the passage. "It's getting harder to breathe down here," he said, his voice tight with fear. The air was thick with a strange, suffocating energy, the vibrations from the train pulsing through the walls. The temperature had dropped even further, the cold seeping into their bones. They pushed on, the passage narrowing even more, the walls closing in like a living thing, trying to suffocate them. Jack's mind raced, adrenaline flooding his system as he tried to focus on their only goal, escape. But then, ahead of them, the passage seemed to open up into something much larger. The moment they stepped into the open space, the temperature dropped even further, and Jack felt a chill run through his spine. The space was vast, so large that it made the previous rooms feel claustrophobic. It looked like a massive chamber, but there was no telling what was inside. It was impossible to make out the details in the darkness, but the hum of the train, the growl of the entity, had grown louder, more intense. And then something moved. A shadow darted across the far wall of the chamber, too quick to see, but its presence undeniable. Jack felt a surge of panic. "We're not alone," he whispered. Max froze. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," Jack said, his voice low, barely a whisper. "But we need to keep moving." But as they took a step forward, the ground beneath them shook again. The walls of the chamber began to shift, warping, twisting like something alive. The passage behind them closed off with an unsettling finality, sealing them in. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he looked around, realizing with horror that they were trapped. And then, in the distance, the voice came again. "You cannot escape me." The chamber felt like the belly of some enormous beast, its walls pulsing with an eerie, unnatural energy. The air was suffocating, thick with an oppressive force that made each breath feel like a struggle. Every shadow in the room seemed to move, an unnatural presence hanging in the air. "We're trapped," Max whispered, his voice barely audible, his eyes darting around nervously. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the dark expanse of the chamber. The walls, the ceiling, even the floor seemed to bend and ripple as if the very structure of the train was alive, breathing in time with the malevolent force they had unleashed. "What the hell is going on?" Sarah murmured, her hand gripping Jack's arm. "I don't know," Jack said, his voice tight with tension. "But we're not alone." The voice from before echoed again, its tone low and guttural, reverberating through the walls. "You cannot escape me." The temperature in the chamber plummeted, and the walls seemed to close in around them, making the space feel even more claustrophobic. Jack could hear the faint scrape of metal against metal, the groaning of the train, as though the very structure was protesting their presence. And then the shadow appeared again. It was just a flicker at first, like a wisp of smoke, but it quickly solidified into something far more terrifying. A massive shape, shrouded in darkness, moving with an unnatural fluidity. It was as if the shadow was part of the very air itself, a living, breathing entity that existed only to consume. Max stumbled backward, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," Jack said, his voice low, "but we need to move." The shadow lunged at them with terrifying speed, but Jack didn't hesitate. He grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward the far side of the chamber, shouting for Max to follow. The walls around them seemed to bend, twisting in on themselves, creating new pathways as the train fought to contain whatever was inside. "Keep moving," Jack yelled, his voice hoarse. They were running now, dodging debris and scrambling over the uneven ground. The walls seemed to collapse around them, the very structure of the train coming apart, piece by piece. The shadow followed them, relentless, its form shifting and warping, never staying in one place. It was as if the darkness itself had come to life, an insidious force that moved like liquid, too fast to track with the eye. Jack's mind raced. They had to get out of here, had to find a way to stop whatever was hunting them. The voice, the growl from the core, it was all connected. The entity that had been awakened was here in this chamber, and it was angry. Ahead of them, the chamber seemed to open up further, but it wasn't an exit. It was another massive room, but this one was different, darker, colder, more oppressive. And at the center of the room, hovering in midair, was a strange, pulsating object. It was unlike anything Jack had ever seen, an amalgamation of metal and organic matter, glowing with a sickly, greenish light. "That's it," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "That's what's controlling everything." Jack's eyes locked onto the object. The train, the entity, it was all connected to that. He had to destroy it. They had no choice. But as they took a step toward the object, the shadow surged forward, a massive, dark mass that seemed to consume the very light around it. It swarmed toward them, faster than Jack could react. "You cannot defeat me," the voice echoed, its tone now maddening, a roar of pure fury. "You have unleashed the beast. There is no escape." Jack gritted his teeth. He didn't have time to think. The shadow was almost upon them. Without a word, he shoved Sarah and Max toward the object, signaling them to run. "I'll hold it off," Jack shouted, turning toward the mass of shifting darkness. His body was tense, his mind focused. He didn't know what he was going to do, but he couldn't let them die here. Not like this. The shadow screeched, a sound so hideous it made Jack's skin crawl. He stood his ground, his heart hammering in his chest. The creature was fast, its form flickering in and out of existence, but Jack kept his focus. He couldn't let it reach them. "You cannot escape me," the voice repeated, now more of a scream than a whisper, as if the entity was truly losing control. "You've broken the seals. You have unleashed me into your world." Jack's mind flashed to the core, the heart of the train. That was the key. If he could destroy it, if he could sever the connection between the entity and the train, it might stop it. But the shadow was closing in. His thoughts raced. He grabbed a nearby piece of metal, a jagged shard of debris, and rushed toward the object. The shadow was almost upon him now, its form growing larger, darker, suffocating the light in the room. He swung the metal shard with all his strength, aiming for the pulsating object in the center. There was a flash of light, a jolt of energy that nearly knocked him off his feet. The room trembled violently, and the growl from the core intensified, shaking the very foundation of the train. The shadow recoiled, its form writhing as though in pain. The walls around them cracked, and the train seemed to scream in agony. Jack could feel the power of the entity surging, trying to break free. But then, with a sudden deafening crack, the object shattered. The room exploded in light and sound. The train's groaning reached a crescendo, and the air around them was filled with a chaotic, deafening roar as the entity's grip on the train faltered. The shadow let out a final spine-chilling screech, and then silence. The silence was deafening. For a long moment, it felt like the world itself had stopped, like time had paused in the wake of the explosion. The intense, blinding light that had filled the room slowly faded, leaving only the faint glow of the train's remaining energy. Jack stood motionless, his heart still hammering in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. His ears were ringing, and his vision was blurred. The weight of what had just happened, the destruction, the entity, the unimaginable force they'd just unleashed, crashed down on him all at once. But he didn't dare look away. He couldn't. Not until he was sure. The room had changed. The shadow, the entity, they were gone. The pulsating object in the center, the source of it all, had shattered into 1,000 pieces. The walls of the chamber, once shifting and alive with energy, had stopped moving. The oppressive weight that had filled the air seemed to lift, and for the first time, there was a hint of stillness, of normalcy. But something wasn't right. The train was groaning, its body shifting as if it were wounded, trying to move despite the damage. The whole structure seemed to be dying. It was as if, in destroying the core, they had killed the heart of the train. "Is it over?" Max's voice broke the silence, weak but hopeful. He was still standing, shaking, his hands pressed against the cool metal of the walls. His eyes were wide, his breath uneven. He looked as though he hadn't fully processed what had happened. "I don't know," Jack replied, his voice hoarse. He didn't feel relieved. He felt hollow, empty. The aftermath of what they'd done was just beginning to sink in. They hadn't just stopped a monster. They'd stopped an entire force that had been tied to this place for generations, and there was no going back from that. Sarah's voice trembled, but there was a trace of hope in it. "We did it, right? We stopped it." Jack looked over at her. Her face was pale, covered in grime and sweat, but there was something in her eyes, an understanding of the weight of what they'd just faced. "We think we did," Jack said, glancing back toward the shattered remains of the core. The pieces were scattered across the room, glowing faintly in the dark like dying embers. "But I don't know how long this thing's been alive. We don't know what kind of damage we've really done." Max wiped his face with the back of his hand, looking around the chamber. "What now? We can't stay here." No one argued. They didn't have time. The train, the very place they'd found themselves trapped in, was coming apart. It was still groaning, still shifting, its walls bending in ways that defied logic. It was dying, slowly, painfully. "We need to find a way out of here," Jack said firmly, his mind already moving ahead. Now. They turned and moved quickly, their footsteps echoing off the warped walls as they searched for an exit. The air was thick with a strange energy, but it was no longer suffocating. It was simply wrong, like the train itself was in pain, struggling against a force far stronger than its own structure. As they passed through the corridors, the train seemed quieter now. The hum of the core, the growl of the entity, gone. There was a heavy stillness in the air, but it wasn't peaceful. It was like the world was holding its breath. And then, up ahead, a faint light appeared. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He broke into a run, calling for Max and Sarah to follow. They didn't hesitate. They ran, desperation pushing them forward toward the faint glow that promised an end to their nightmare. The hallway opened up, and there, just ahead, was the entrance, an exit, small but enough. The outside world. "We made it," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling as she reached the threshold. Jack stood beside her, his heart still pounding. He looked out into the bleak, overgrown landscape that stretched before them, the silent wasteland of Chernobyl. They had made it out, but at what cost? Max joined them, and together they stepped out into the cold, desolate world outside. The air was harsh, the wind biting at their skin, but it felt different. It felt real. Jack paused for a moment, looking back at the train, now distant and broken. It was impossible to tell how much time had passed, or if they were even truly free. The train had been a nightmare, something unnatural, something alive in a way that shouldn't be possible. But they had survived. The entity had been stopped. The train had been destroyed, for now at least. As they turned to walk away, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that their escape had come at a cost. The entity had been bound to the train, and they had shattered that connection. But what else had they unleashed? What else had been tied to that darkness? But for now, there was nothing more they could do. They were alive. They were free. And that was enough. The drive back to Kiev was long, the roads slick with rain, and the city felt as far away from Chernobyl as possible. But the weight of what they had just experienced hung heavily over them. Jack, Sarah, Max, and Oliver sat in the car, all of them lost in their thoughts, the silence between them thick and uncomfortable. They had survived the unthinkable, but what did it all mean? The train, the entity, the destruction, they had barely escaped with their lives, and now they had to face the consequences. Oliver, who had been unusually quiet the entire ride, finally spoke up. What if we didn't actually destroy it? His voice was low, the doubt clear in his words. What if we just pissed it off? Max glanced at him in the rearview mirror. You mean like it's gonna come after us? Maybe not us, Oliver replied. But it's still out there, isn't it? We don't know what we've really done. Jack rubbed his face, trying to shake off the lingering tension. For now, let's just focus on getting back to Kiev. We'll figure it out there. When they arrived in Kiev, the noise, the bustle, and the sheer normalcy of the city felt like a distant memory from another life. It had been just days since they had escaped Chernobyl, but it felt like a lifetime. The drive, the quiet exchange of words, had given them all too much time to reflect. But now there was something almost surreal about being back in the heart of the city, so vibrant, so full of life, so ordinary. They made their way to a small, nondescript building on the outskirts of Kiev, an unassuming place where local urban explorers gathered. It was a spot the group had heard about during their time in Chernobyl. If anyone would have answers, or at least an open mind, it would be them. But they weren't prepared for how the locals would react. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of stale coffee and the quiet hum of a few fluorescent lights overhead. Maps and photos of abandoned places covered the walls, some familiar, some almost unrecognizable. The explorers were gathered around a table, deep in conversation when Jack, Sarah, Max, and Oliver walked in. The first to look up was a guy named Andrei, his arms crossed and a wide grin on his face as he sized up the newcomers. You guys look like you've seen a ghost, or maybe a whole damn trainload of them, he said, his tone light, but with an edge of mockery. Did you find any radioactive zombies out there, or was it just the usual creepy stuff? Jack froze for a moment, taken aback by his casual tone. He had expected skepticism, but not this level of teasing. He forced himself to smile, although it felt forced. Actually, we did find something, he said, glancing at Sarah and Max before adding, something, alive. Andrei raised an eyebrow. Alive? What, like a haunted train? Was it pulling actual ghosts, or was it just a bunch of weird noises? Oliver spoke up, his voice dry. No, it was more than that. The train had something inside of it, a force, a presence that we couldn't explain. We think it was tied to Chernobyl itself. The others in the room exchanged amused looks. Another explorer, named Tanya, laughed lightly. So you're telling me you found some ancient vengeful spirit trapped in a train? Sounds like a great plot for a movie. Max rolled his eyes. I swear to God, We're not making this up. Oh no, I'm sure you're not, Andrei said with a sly grin. After all, everyone's got a good ghost story after a trip to Chernobyl. It's kind of like a rite of passage, right? The place has a way of messing with your head. You don't understand, Sarah said, her frustration starting to creep into her voice. We felt it. It was real. We weren't just hearing things. Tanya leaned forward with a teasing look. Oh, no doubt you had a real experience. But you know, most people just see a little rust on the tracks and start imagining all sorts of horrors. It's part of the fun. You get caught up in the atmosphere, and before you know it, you've seen something that was never there. Jack's eyes narrowed, frustration building. You're not listening. Of course we are, Andrei interrupted, still grinning. You're here, right? You've got the best stories in the room. But here's the thing. There's a reason people come to places like Chernobyl or Pripyat or all the other abandoned spots around here. We're looking for what's hidden. Some of us find it, some of us don't. But the truth is, Chernobyl's been broken for decades. It plays tricks on your mind. It gets inside you. Jack looked at the others, seeing the same doubt flicker in their eyes. They had come here for answers, or at least someone who might take their experiences seriously. Instead, they were being laughed off. We're not crazy, Sarah said, her voice tight. This wasn't a trick of the mind. We felt it inside us. The train. It wasn't just a train. It was alive. Andrei's grin faded, and for the first time, his expression shifted into something more contemplative. Okay. So maybe there's a little more to this than just an old abandoned train. But let me tell you something. He leaned forward. People come here thinking they're going to find ghosts or spirits or something terrifying, and maybe they do. But Chernobyl's not just about that. It's a place that breaks people down, bends them in ways they don't expect. If you felt something, it was probably real in some sense. But what you felt, what you think you know, that's just the beginning. Max frowned, clearly not convinced. So, you're saying we didn't actually face some kind of evil force? Andrei shrugged. Who am I to say? But Chernobyl doesn't let people walk away unchanged. Maybe you saw something real. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was something else. But whatever it was, it's something you'll never forget. Trust me on that. Jack felt the unease settle back into his chest. These people weren't going to give them the answers they wanted, not today. But maybe, just maybe, there was something they weren't seeing, something they didn't understand. We'll figure it out, Jack said finally, his voice low but determined. But we're not letting it go. Not now. Andrei gave a small, understanding nod. You don't have to. But just remember, Chernobyl's a place that hides its secrets well. And once you find one, there's always something else lurking in the shadows. The laughter from the urban explorers echoed in the dimly lit room, bouncing off the cracked walls as they all leaned back in their chairs, amused by the group's intensity. Andrei, still grinning, waved a dismissive hand as he looked at Sarah, Max, Oliver, and Jack. Relax. You guys are acting like it's the first time anyone's seen a ghost train in Chernobyl, he said, his voice light but dripping with amusement. You should have seen the first time we went into Pripyat. We thought we were going to die too. Tanya chuckled. It's the first experience. Everyone gets freaked out when they're new. We've all been there. Trust me, by the time you're our age, you'll look back and laugh. Max, who had been holding back his frustration, couldn't stop himself from speaking up. Laugh? You think it's a joke? We almost died in there. Something was in that train. It wasn't just in our heads. Andrei gave him a sympathetic look, almost like a teacher talking to a wayward student. Oh, I'm sure you saw something. It's Chernobyl, man. Weird things happen. There's this phenomenon where people see things. Sometimes it's visual. Sometimes it's emotional. Sometimes it's both. The radiation, the energy from the reactor, the electromagnetic fields, they mess with your brain, distort reality. It's all part of the experience. Jack frowned. So you're saying we didn't see anything real? That it was just a hallucination? Not exactly a hallucination, Andrei replied, leaning forward. But the brain can only handle so much, especially in a place like that. Chernobyl messes with the mind. Some people see things they swear are real. Ghosts, shadows, objects that shouldn't be there. It's all part of the psychological effect the place has on people. It's why they say the real danger in Chernobyl isn't just the radiation, but the mental strain it puts on you. Tanya added with a smirk. We've all seen the ghost train myth. It's just something people start talking about when the place messes with their head. It's not real, but the energy there makes you think it's real. It's like a collective hallucination. Sarah's shoulders slumped, the frustration clear on her face, but there was a flicker of doubt creeping in. She couldn't deny that what they had experienced was too vivid, too real, but these locals were experts. They had been doing this for years. Maybe there was something to what they were saying. Max spoke up, his tone more controlled now. But the sounds, the way the train was moving, as if it had a mind of its own, the feeling of it. We're not imagining that. Oliver was quiet for a moment before he added, and the shadows. They were so intense. I don't know. It felt too real to be just a product of the place. It was like something was alive in there. Andrew's smile softened a bit, as if he understood their hesitation. Look, I'm not saying you're wrong. You felt something, and that's real. But Chernobyl does this to people. It's the energy in the air, the ghosts of the past. It all mixes together and plays tricks on your mind. The ghost train? It's just a story people made up to explain the unexplainable. The place, it wants you to believe. It feeds on that. The other explorers nodded in agreement, as if they had heard this all before. But how do you explain the energy we felt? Sarah asked, a trace of disbelief still in her voice. Energy? Tanya chuckled lightly. Sure, there's energy, but not the kind of energy you're thinking about. We're talking about the lingering residue from the reactor, the breakdown of the environment. It's enough to make your mind wander. Throw in a little fear and the right kind of environment, and boom, your brain fills in the blanks. What you experienced was real to you, but it's part of the psychological effect. The mind tries to make sense of the madness. Jack was quiet for a long moment, staring at the table, his thoughts racing. He wanted to believe them. The logical part of him could see it. It was all possible. But something deep inside him resisted, the memory of that thing inside the train still fresh and haunting. Oliver, noticing Jack's hesitation, said, "So you're saying it's all just a big mind game? That we're all just victims of Chernobyl's chaos?" Andre nodded. "That's exactly it. But hey, don't take our word for it. Go back to the site, take some time, and you'll see. The more you understand it, the less you'll be afraid. But yeah, the first time you go in, it can mess you up. It's almost like the place has a personality, a twisted one." Max shook his head, trying to process everything. "I don't know if I'm buying it." Tanya shrugged. "Doesn't matter if you believe us or not. The place does what it does, and the stories follow. It's the oldest trick in the book, really. Chernobyl doesn't just make ghosts, it makes people believe in ghosts. That's the real power here." There was a brief silence in the room as everyone digested the words. Sarah let out a long breath as though releasing some of the tension she'd been holding on to. "Maybe you're right," she muttered. "Maybe we're all just seeing things." Jack didn't answer right away, his mind racing through the events of the past few days, the feeling of the train moving, the overwhelming sense of something being there. Could it all just be the result of the environment? He wasn't sure, but part of him didn't want to believe it. Not after everything they'd been through. Andre leaned back in his chair, looking satisfied. "Don't worry, kids. It's your first taste. You'll be all right. The more you come out here, the more you'll learn how to separate what's real from what's just your mind playing tricks." The flight back to England felt like a different world. The bustling chaos of Kiev, the eerie stillness of Chernobyl, and the weight of everything they had experienced still clung to them. But now, with the familiar sight of London below as their plane descended, it all felt like a distant memory. A strange, surreal chapter of their lives. Jack, Sarah, Max, and Oliver sat in the small cafe at Heathrow, a low hum of chatter and clinking coffee cups filling the air around them. The reality of being back in the comfort of their own country, where life went on as usual, was jarring. They had survived one of the most unsettling experiences of their lives, yet there was no one who could truly understand what they had been through. Not here. "Feels good to be back," Max said, his voice distant as he stared out the window at the gray sky. "I don't know if I'll ever look at abandoned places the same way again." Jack nodded, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "Yeah, me neither. I keep thinking about that train and the way it felt. It's hard to just let it go, you know?" Sarah, sitting across from him, let out a soft laugh, but it was tinged with exhaustion. I can't believe we're sitting here talking about it like it's a dream. I keep thinking maybe it was all just a weird hallucination. Oliver, who had been quiet since their arrival, spoke up. I don't think it was just our minds playing tricks. We felt something. And that thing in the tunnel, it was real. We can't deny that. Max raised an eyebrow. But the way the others explained it, the whole energy thing, it makes sense. I mean, we all know Chernobyl's messed up. Radiation, the weird atmosphere, the power lines. It's no surprise our minds could have twisted things around. Yeah, but we weren't the only ones to feel it, Sarah pointed out. The others we met in Kiev, the ones who've been doing this for years, they all brushed it off like it was nothing. But they didn't experience what we did. Jack paused, thinking about the teasing laughter of the urban explorers back in Kiev. I still don't understand why they reacted like that. They knew more than they let on. I can't shake the feeling that they were holding something back. Oliver sighed, rubbing his temples. Maybe they were just used to it. Maybe they've seen so many strange things that they don't know what's real anymore. But for us, it felt like a warning, something we weren't meant to see or understand. Max shook his head. It's hard to say, but we'll never really know, will we? Not unless we go back. And I don't think any of us are going to do that anytime soon. The group fell into a heavy silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The weight of the experience in Chernobyl was still there, lingering in the background, a shadow over their everyday lives. They had tried to make sense of it, to understand what they had encountered, but in the end, the questions remained unanswered. It's over, Jack said after a long moment. Whatever it was, it's done. We got out. We can't change what happened. We just have to move on. Sarah nodded, though her expression was distant. Yeah, but I don't think I'll ever forget it. That place, it's like it gets inside you. Max picked up his coffee cup and took a sip. Maybe it gets inside everyone. Maybe that's why people keep going back, to find answers, or maybe just to feel something again. Oliver leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the passing clouds. It's weird, isn't it? You go to a place like Chernobyl expecting to find ghosts or some dark secret, but in the end, you find something else, something that doesn't have an easy explanation, something that doesn't go away when you leave. Jack smiled faintly, a tired but understanding look in his eyes. Yeah, I guess that's the thing about places like that. You can't just leave them behind. They stay with you. And with that, the conversation faded into a quiet understanding between them. They had faced something together, something that no one else would ever fully grasp, but they had survived. And for now, that was enough. As they gathered their things and stood to leave the cafe, Sarah paused at the door, glancing back over her shoulder. The world outside seemed so ordinary, so untouched by the horrors they had faced. But deep down, she knew that what they had seen in Chernobyl would always be with them, just beneath the surface. And maybe, just maybe, it would be a story they would tell one day. But not today. Today, they were just four friends, back home, trying to make sense of everything. They walked out into the gray afternoon, the weight of the past lifting just a little with each step, as life, in all its strange and quiet beauty, carried on around them. The end. Subscribe to the channel if you want more stories.